Good evening. Our first speaker is Detective Ken Williams. Detective Ken Williams is one of the leading use of force and police reform experts in the country. He's a former Boston area homicide detective, and since then has been retained by civil rights attorneys for his expertise. You may have seen him on NBC's Black and Blue, CNN's Nancy Grace, and even on a TEDx talk where he gave a speech about the follow-up to Ferguson. If you guys could please welcome Detective Ken Williams.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to each of you. As a retired homicide detective, I come to you today from the front lines of the war. And it is a war. It's extremely important to phrase it in that sense because people who have been taken, captured, have been put into a prison, they're prisoners of the war. Millions of people. In fact, this war since 1971 has captured roughly 40 million souls. 40 million people since 1971 have found themselves incarcerated. Staggering. Roughly 20 million for low-level possessionary offense of marijuana. 20 million. Another staggering fact. Most of those 20 million arrested for a low-level possessionary offense look like me. Majority of them are black men taken off the street, subjected to a penal system that is lopsided, unfair, discriminatory. Just so that I can understand the experts that I might have here in the crowd with me, just a show of hands, please. How many people know of someone that's been incarcerated in this penal system? Just raise your hands, please. Let it reflect that the room has a majority of hands up of someone that someone knows or they themselves personally have been captured and put into this penal system. You're the experts. You're the taxpayers that are funding this machine. So I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to lay this thing out for you based on my experience from being on the front line. The 1964 Civil Rights Act came way before the war on drugs. Before that, 1954, Brown versus Board of Education ended segregation in schools, bringing new hope to people who had not been treated fairly based on the color of their skin. Before that, we had a civil war, which changed the amendments to grant citizenship and freedom to all, regardless of their color, but yet and still, after a civil war, we had Jim Crow laws, debt peonage laws, all types of laws that were passed to subject people based on the color of their skin again to control by enforcement. So we're not talking about a new game here. We're talking about a wash, rinse, and repeat of the same game since the 16th century. The same exact game. When I look at the black community that I patrolled, when I was hired in 1994 after President Clinton passed the COPS grants, the COPS program through the DOJ to investigate pattern practice, but at the same time hire 100,000 police officers, I was one of those people that was hired in 1995 under the COPS grants. I had some experience prior to becoming a member of law enforcement as a black man growing up in the city of Boston, having witnessed discrimination. I said, wow, I'm going to join the rank and file of men and women to see what I can do to change this. I can tell you something. The system spit me out. I'm a whistleblower cop. We'll get to that a little bit later on. 1971, Nixon came along and said, after the Civil Rights Act had been passed in '64, let's figure out a new game, a new policy that will control a certain segment of the population, but not all similarly situated. What do I mean by that? The low-level possessionary offense of marijuana, for instance, I'm going to stick with that particular crime, has not negatively impacted white men the same as it has negatively impacted black men. But both groups use the drug similarly. So how is it that I'm age 50 years old, I've never been locked up, but 1 in 3 black men that look like me has, for a low-level possessionary offense? White men similarly situated, the statistic is 1 in 17, 1 in 20. And I would argue it's actually greater than that, but I'll explain to you why a little bit later on. The issue becomes, how is it that law enforcement across this country, without getting into a room like this, Great Hall here at FAMU, sitting down and colluding with each other, a plan of action to be discriminatory? How is it that across the land, without people picking up phones and communicating with each other, how is it that they all came to the same conclusion, the same pattern in practice, which today has landed 1 in 3 black men in jail and not others similarly situated? It's because discrimination is longstanding, it's rooted in the soil of America, and until we have an honest discussion about that, we merely scratch the surface and we don't get to the solutions.